Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome back from break. Hopefully you were able to stretch your legs. Just wanted to quickly introduce myself. My name is Blaine Volpe. I'm a state caucus manager here with MAP. If you have any questions or you need anything throughout the day, feel free to chat me. I am going to introduce our next session, but before we start our next session, I'm going to ask you all to please turn off your video and audio in the bottom left-hand corner of your Zoom window. Please click the three dots in the right-hand corner of your box and click Hide Non-Video Participants. This will allow for a better view of the panel. You can also view instructions in the chat that I'm about to put in. And while you all do that, please welcome Layla Zayden.
All right, excellent. Well, hello, everybody. It looks like, everybody followed your instructions very well, Blaine. So good job. I know the Zoom technology is a learning curve for all of us, but everyone, I am Layla Zayden. I'm the Executive Director and COO here at Millennial Action Project. Really great to see a lot of familiar faces here. And we're so excited to bring you this next conversation. These panelists all come from very different backgrounds, from business to politics, from advocacy to academia, but they all have one very important thing in common, which is they know what it takes to be a successful leader. Through their own personal experiences and some insights that they've had over the years, the goal of this conversation is to draw out some lessons and key principles that will help all of us effectively build the political bridges that we really need in order to drive change. So welcome to our panelists. I'll introduce you briefly and then we can just jump right into questions. I'll also note for legislators on the call, if you'd like to submit questions in the Zoom chat, we'll be looking at those. And then for anyone following along on the live stream, just make sure to tweet at Action Project with the hashtag 2020 Future Summit, and we'll see how many audience questions we can squeeze in at the end. So first up, we have Dr. Chris Gibson, who's a former congressman from my home state of New York, representing the 19th District. He joined the US Army after graduating from Siena College, and a Purple Heart, 4 Bronze Stars later, he is now the president of Siena College. He sits on MAP's advisory board and has a long legacy of helping MAP find outstanding summer interns, including one who I'm about to totally embarrass, Maya, who some of you will meet in your breakout sessions later today. Next, we have Dr. Lara Brown, Associate Professor and the Director of the Graduate School of Political Management at the George Washington University, a distinguished writer and scholar who has written extensively on the presidency. Lara is a frequent presence in the media, serving as an expert on national elections, candidate strategies, political scandals, and presidential leadership. Next, we have Chon Yang, who actually attended the very first Future Summit years ago in Boston as a guest. So some of you might recognize him, the OGs on this call. He's a social entrepreneur and founder of, among other organizations, the international advocacy group Give One Project. Chon has spent much of his adult life engaging and empowering young leaders around social, economic, and environmental goals. He has been a longtime friend of MAP and also sits on our advisory board. And last but not least, Robbie Bach. If any of you have ever played Halo, you have Robbie to thank. Robbie led the creation of Xbox as Microsoft's chief Xbox officer. And after 22 years at Microsoft, has stepped into the civic space, now in his new role as civic engineer, which is arguably a cooler title than chief Xbox officer. Robbie works to build and strengthen civic engagement among people and organizations looking to create positive change. So once again, welcome to our 4 panelists. Chris, my first question is for you. So the conversation today is about what it means to be a leader and how we can apply those principles to our own work in reaching across the aisle. You shared a story about leadership from your time in the Army while deployed in Iraq in 2005. The story is about 2 young men who embodied the idea of courage and selflessness, who really chose to do the right thing and not the easy thing, and were willing to pay the ultimate price for it. Could you share that story with our audience and just what it means to you?
Yeah, well, thanks, Leila, and to everyone here, good afternoon. And indeed, Maya, I'm so incredibly proud of her, one of my students at Williams College. And to all our legislators here today, seeking really to improve themselves and to be more effective, to be better servants of their constituents. I just want to affirm being part of Millennial Action Project is illustrative that you're sincere and you already are making a difference. And I say that from experiences. I worked with MAP while I was in Congress. And, you're asking about our paratroopers that gave the ultimate sacrifice. And I'm going to share in a moment these stories. But, I would tell you, it really brings out a broader point, which is how important trust is to leadership. In this case, these paratroopers made the ultimate sacrifice, but it's because they really believed. They believed in this way of life. They believed in their buddy on their left and right, and they really believed in what the country was asking them to do, regardless of whether or not they agreed with the political aspect of the war. So, these two young men, Chris Pusaterri was from upstate New York, and he was in many ways kind of a typical, late teen, early 20, had a great sense of humor. He loved the outdoors. He really just loved life. And, this young man had done tremendous work for the 82nd Airborne Division, and he, in fact, had re-enlisted to go essentially close to his home back in upstate New York. He had re-enlisted to go to the 10th Mountain Division, which is based in Watertown, up the North Country of New York. And he was on a glide path to go there when we were notified with, basically we had to leave within 24 to 48 hours to go to Iraq on an emergency deployment to help out in the greater Baghdad area. Chris had reached out and said, I can't have this, that you guys all go back to war and then I just go off to upstate New York. And so Chris actually notified the chain of command that he wanted to cancel his re-enlistment change of station and go with us to Iraq. And that was a very serious request. We contemplated it very carefully, and ultimately I did approve that. And, Chris was a guy that was there for his buddy every single day on Earth, including his last one, because, he had been on duty all night long. And so he had finished around 5:30 in the morning, and his mission at that point was really to get rest, to be ready for the next shift that he would have in about 12 hours. But a little after 6, a gunfight erupted with a very formidable cell, Al-Qaeda cell that we were battling in Mosul, Iraq. And Chris, rather than staying right there and keeping getting rest, he popped up, he got his kit on, and he moved to cover his buddy. And ultimately in that gunfight that ensued, he was mortally wounded. And it stunned the whole outfit because they saw what he did to be there for it. And in fact, we learned the next day, I did not know at the time, this young man was born on the 4th of July. And it just struck me as apt because he was red, white, and blue to the core. But this was really the culmination of a commitment that was unlimited. And his buddy, Zach Wobbler, a different kind of guy, but in some respects, they shared some of the same attributes. But this guy was, I'm convinced he could have gotten into an Ivy League school. He had a rapier-like wit. The guy was he could write limericks. He was a guitar player, and everybody loved it. But you just didn't want to be, you didn't want to have you didn't want to be the bane of, you didn't really want to be the target of his witticisms. But that was what made life interesting and fun. And Zach, likewise, he at that point had risen. He had been the paratrooper of the year. He had risen to leadership, and he was leading a squad. And they were engaged in a deadly fight with the enemy. And what had happened is we had wounded one of the enemy. And Zach, understanding the rules of engagement, knew that the battle had been over. This enemy was wounded, and he knew his duty. His duty was to treat that wounded enemy. And so he moved his unit. He got the wounded trooper, and he moved him to a safe, what he thought was a safe location. They began to perform first aid when, essentially an armed element of the enemy surprised our unit, moved and shot down in the alleyway and mortally wounded Zach Wadler. So, in an effort to save the life of a wounded combatant, he lost his own. And, I think from these two stories, I want everyone to appreciate just these were young men that were really in their early 20s, and they had their whole life in front of them. But the culmination of their commitment to each other and to the unit is part of what leadership's all about. We hope that there's a day that we never see war again, that we would see no battles. But I mean, I would tell you that what I took away from this is just how important training's important, but also cohesion. And that's the thing, when I'm talking to leaders here that are serving, you're serving in a hard time. I mean, it's a very polarized time. Country is bitterly divided, in some cases disillusioned, even angry. And your constituents are looking to you. They're looking to you for leadership right now. And, the criticality of trust in your work at home, in your accessibility, your transparency, and the accountability, even as divided as the country is, when you hold town hall meetings, both in person and virtually, and you take any question, as tough of them, and I've been through that myself, as hard as that is, you may think, wow, this is hard stuff. And you are making a positive difference in ways that you can't even imagine, just by standing and being accountable. You're building trust at home. And then in the work you're doing now with other legislators through MAP and in the work in your state house, you are actually that what you're doing is you're providing the beginnings of conversations that are going to lead to compromise and necessary legislation that moves us forward. And so, that's the thing to remember, is to keep that front and center, is that trust is when your colleague, regardless of what party that they're in, needs you, they're in a tough bind, and you've been working that relationship to get meaningful legislation done, you never leave them. You always have their back, in the way that Zach and Chris had their buddies back. And that's the thing that we can abstract from this and transcend, and never forget those sacrifices. And I want to conclude with this, that I will never forget the sacrifices that they made, but I also want to tell you, I deeply appreciate the commitments and sacrifices that you are making right now on behalf of our country. Thank you, Layla.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that story, Chris. And I think it's such a powerful story, because a lot of the strength and success of, as you say, kind of the cohesiveness of the unit comes from a compassion and a trust that's built over time. And Lara, I want to pick up on what Chris just said about this idea of kind of leading through compassion. And you've done a lot of thinking around how character and kind of this idea can make or break actually a president. And you've been able to study and research every president that we've had to kind of measure what does make them more or less successful, especially as we're, governing over a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different types of people, a lot of different opinions. So what is it that can make a president effective when it comes to that? And does that translate out of the Oval Office? And you might be on mute.
I thought I had undone that. But anyway, let me just say again, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. I'm really honored to be here and to have an opportunity to speak, not just with our colleagues on this panel, but also with all these state legislators and all of these young people who are looking to make a difference in the world of politics. I will say this, and this comes from a lifetime of trying to understand kind of the intersection of character and leadership. And it really begins, from my perspective, by understanding that actions are the manifestation of your character. So who you are is reflected in what you do. You can say you are one thing, but if your actions do not essentially evince that to other people, they are not going to see that your character embodies those things. And so I really do believe that a successful leader has to not just sort of talk the talk, but they have to walk the walk. And they have to think about how their actions will be read, not just kind of from a policy standpoint, but from kind of this ethical and moral standpoint. And are you, if you will, conveying to your constituents or to any of the individuals that you are working with kind of the appropriate demeanor? And this is where I really argue in my book that there are essentially 3 dimensions of leadership. So a leader can kind of choose to go at things with what I consider to be courage. And that usually means some level of confrontation or risk-taking or some level at which you are taking immediate and decisive action and you're hoping to demonstrate some level of courage. But that's not the only way to lead. And I think, unfortunately, some people believe that's all there is. In fact, 2 other really important leadership strategies that if you look at presidents like George Washington or Abraham Lincoln, who were extraordinary in their actions, they knew how to lead in these other dimensions. So let me explain these 2 other dimensions. One is what I call curiosity. And by curiosity, I mean that a leader really oftentimes is kind of seeking a delay in the decision. But as part of the delay, you ask questions. You might set up an expert commission. You might want to consult or be shown in conversation or in consultation with experts in a given field. A lot of what you're trying to do is say and convey to people, I take my job seriously. I know that I don't know everything, and I'm going to approach a situation that is new to me with some level of humility because I respect you enough to try to find out the best answer, not just my immediate reaction. So I think leading with curiosity is an important dimension through which to lead. And then I really think there's a 3rd dimension, which you just kind of touched on, which is that sense of leading with compassion or empathy. And much that goes on with kind of this leadership approach is in fact not very active. I mean, people are surprised that what it really means is to hear people, to listen to people, to kind of paraphrase back what others say so that you can let them know that you are hearing them and that their message matters to you. You know, I think there was a viral video the other day where there was a local, you know, I think city council meeting and an individual on the council picked up her phone and that sparked a reaction from somebody in the audience who essentially said, you obviously don't care about what I have to say if you're looking at your phone, right? And so this is where your actions really do speak for who you are and what is important to you. And I think, you know, former Representative Gibson's comments about these 2 young men, right? You have one man who essentially voluntarily decided in a very courageous act, I want to be in the fight. And another one who took a sense of empathy and led with this idea that I need to actually provide some first aid to a combatant who was wounded, right? Both of those are manifestly incredible kind of demonstrations of leadership. And so we need to understand that a really good leader has this ability to kind of pivot and be aware of what's needed at what moment. And part of the reason why I would argue that our modern presidents have kind of done so poorly is that they all try to be too much of their own brand, meaning that they really only know how to be who they are and they don't really think about the role they're in and what actually the role requires of them, which might mean learning more, being more, and thinking about how you can engage with others in a way that's not self-oriented.
Yeah. I love this point that you make about there being many different dimensions of leadership, and there's not just one way to be a leader. And I think it totally underlines this bigger idea that you're not necessarily a natural born leader, but leadership is really a skill that you practice and that you can learn. Joan, I'd like to expand on that point with you, because you yourself came to the United States and developed, I would say, through, is it Chris who says you went to the School of Hard Knocks? I think, Joan, you also went to the School of Hard Knocks and developed leadership skills that you've now brought back and are empowering young people on the international stage to bridge divides, not just in a political sense, but to bridge gender, race, class, environmental issues. You know, my question for you is, as you have studied what it means to be a good leader, and you've studied the works of some of the greats like Dr. King and Nelson Mandela. I believe you actually had a conversation with his widow. So first, I would love to hear what that conversation was like. But two, what are the skills that you are empowering young people with? Is there something in this generation that you see as an inherent ability to follow in the steps of some of these iconic leaders, or is it skills that are really within reach for all of us to learn and practice and develop? And you might need to unmute yourself right now too, Joan.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
Well, thank you so much. Greetings from the great country of Senegal in West Africa. And this is my first Zoom call, so be a little patient with me here. Trying to figure it out.
You're doing so great so far. You're doing great.
Right. So, about leadership, I've lived in America this past 20 years and recently just, moved back home. And all of my work from the States, I was living in the state of Ohio and then in Washington, D.C., all working through leadership, supporting young people in leadership and entrepreneurship. But now into my nonprofit Give One project is in 34 countries around the world, in all continents, from France to Japan to other countries in Africa here and Canada and the US and etc. The idea for me was, how can the bridges I was missing growing up? There was a lot of challenges for me growing up here in Africa with so many things that I didn't have access to. So I grew up in poverty here and I wanted a better life for me and my family. So I came to the United States. I started from cleaning tables to doing all the things that we're doing today with the organization. So from there, I always looked for the bridges that I didn't have and how can I help to create that? Because to me, leadership is about connecting the dots and creating a path for not only us, but the next generations to come. Because for me to be able to do the things that I was able to do in America, there was generations before me who not only worked for them and their families, but created paths, sacrificed and served the country so they can close the divide, make sure that people who look like me have access to education, have access to opportunities, have access to the political system. And this, for me, it shouldn't stop there. We should push the limits further all the time. And I've started in Ohio and now in Africa, because when I came back home, I saw so many different things that were missing, that I knew something needed to be done. For example, when it comes to agriculture, I'm investing in a lot in farming, but more into a social enterprise. Because I couldn't understand where we have the most edible land in the world, the youngest generation in the world, and then all of the sun that we have all over, but yet we're waiting for Europe or the US to feed us. Me being trained in America with that idea of getting involved and teaching by showing, I had to be a farmer now to show young people that we really can feed ourselves. Mm-hmm. So to me, leadership is about showing by example. It's about service. It's about, to me, something beyond yourself. What can you do to better the lives of so many that you will touch that you might not even be able to meet? To me, it was all about that. Then I invested with Akon, an American artist, in energy, the same deal. When we came, we see there's shortages all the time, 600 million Africans without electricity. So we joined our hands together to make sure we bring a solution towards that. So all of the things that I'm involved here is trying to solve problems that are in the dear needs of all of these people that I'm surrounded with. How can I make sure that the experience I've acquired in America and across the world can benefit my own people? And I think it's about service again. So when I had dinner with Mama Gracia, who's the widow of Nelson Mandela, Akon and I asked a few questions to her. I was asking her, how was it living with Nelson Mandela? But then what is the leadership, what is the advice that she can give us as young people who are trying to make a difference in the continent and beyond? She responded to me that our generation, she's talking, that her ex-husband, Nelson Mandela, and all of the presidents, and Nkrumah, and etc., they sacrificed. They worked so hard to make sure that African nations had independence. Their biggest fight was for them to decolonize the continent. They were successful on that battle, but there are still so many battles that needs to be fought. And particularly the economic independence that you guys, your new generation, need to create. You need to create a playing field. You need to drive that battle. So these generations behind you, because you're influencing so many young people, so many people are following you on social media. Nelson Mandela was able to make a difference, change the whole continent without having Twitter and Instagram and all of these things, right? And you guys have that in your hands. You can touch so many millions. Akon had 50-something million followers. I have 600,000 people following me. So how are you using that? And you should drive that to inspire change by what you're doing, not what you're saying, right? And I think that spoke so much to me that I decided to move back home from that conversation and then drive that economic change, which is getting more young people in the grassroots level to do what President Obama talked about, that change should come from the bottom up. And there's this fierce urgency of serving our communities, where we're not only looking at what we're getting today, but how much we're affecting the future. Mm-hmm. This is my take as an introduction in what I think is about service, and it's about, going beyond the needs of today, but the generations that are coming ahead of us.
Yeah. And what you just said about not seeing just problems, but seeing solutions, I think is so important, and kind of looking within and kind of understanding yourself and what your opportunities are and what you can be in order to actually solve those problems, right? And kind of overcoming some of those challenges. Robbie, I want to bring you in here, and on this topic about kind of knowing your own values and being able to define what it is that you're trying to do. Let's start with talking about your time at Microsoft, specifically your experience leading the creation of the world's first Xbox. You have referred to this, and this is true, I found a quote of you saying this online, as a near-death experience.
Right.
So what about the Xbox story ultimately led you to that point? And how did the strategy framework that you developed from that experience then drive you into the civic space?
Yeah, so Xbox was one of those interesting projects. I mean, I feel bad calling it a near-death experience. I listened to what Chris discussed and the things Joan's gone through. In my case, the challenges of Xbox were sort of business challenges, maybe not quite as personal as those. But they really were, it was a difficult problem. We had 18 months to produce the world's most powerful video game console, and Microsoft's experience in the space was producing the Microsoft mouse. So we really didn't have a lot of tools. And so the challenge was, how do you go from 20 people to 2,000 people in 18 months and produce this really cool piece of hardware? And I will tell you, from a leadership perspective, I love listening to the other panelists because they all talked about different aspects of leadership. And if there's a thing I learned during that Xbox experience, is that everybody has sort of their own unique superpowers. And in that first 18 months of running the Xbox business, I didn't understand my leadership superpower. And as a result, that project for that 18 months was very poorly led. It was chaotic. We really struggled to make decisions. We struggled for the team to come together. And the only reason the product shipped is because the individuals themselves, as individuals, were really great at what they did. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't because of leadership. And so for me, I had to step back and learn, okay, what's my leadership superpower? And do I really understand it? And then how can I empower the people around me to use their leadership superpowers? And so how does the team become, I call this my Avengers theory, how does the team become better as a team when each of the superpowers are used together? One of the things we had to do to make that happen was develop this strategy framework called the 3P framework. And it's really pretty simple. If you're doing something complicated, something difficult, something really challenging, Joan talked about bringing electricity to Africa, you have to have a really simple strategy. 3 things. Do you have a 1-sentence North Star that describes what you're trying to do? That's your purpose. Can you write down 5 principles, which are about how you're going to operate, how you're going to make decisions, how you're going to work as a team, sort of what the culture of the group's going to be? So purpose and principles. And then can you establish 5 priorities, 5 things you're going to actually do to make sure they happen that will drive you towards that ultimate purpose? And you can write that down in 1 page. Purpose, principles, priorities. And you only get 5 principles, you only get 5 priorities. You have to really reduce things to their simplistic, most simplistic point. And when you do that for a team of 2,000 people, suddenly you empower them to go do things. It's this weird thing where simplicity brings the ability to overcome complexity. And that framework changed the course of Xbox in a fundamental way. And suddenly Xbox became a joy. And the last 5 years of my work on that project really were joyful. And the second version of our journey, Xbox 360, was significantly more successful as a result.
Mm-hmm. And so is that framework something that you can apply outside of the business corporate world?
Yeah, in fact, I use that framework in all of my nonprofit work and my consulting. I work with Boys and Girls Clubs of America. I do some work with an organization called Year Up, a number of other organizations. And the framework is so simple. I use it for myself. So I have a little 3P framework for myself that I keep in my desk drawer, and I pull it out every once in a while. My purpose statement is to inspire and empower an army of civic engineers. I have a set of principles that I work with and a set of 5 things I'm trying to get done right now. And every 3 or 4 months, I pull it out, I look at it, I adjust the priorities a little bit, I march forward. So I use it in my personal life, I use it in my nonprofit professional life, and I use it in the work that I do with some for-profit companies as well.
Great. So, similar question to the other panelists in terms of principles that you've discussed. And Robbie, I love what you said about everybody's different and has their own superpower, the Avengers model. Thinking about kind of what you've learned in kind of a theoretical sense, right? Like, what does it mean to be a good leader? We've got, 100 young legislators on this meeting right now, and many more across the country who, I think are great leaders already and who want to continue to build the political bridges to actually get things done, right? So how do you take kind of some of your insights, and I actually think all 4 of you have written at least 1 book, if not multiple books, on this very topic. So, how do you take these kind of theoretical insights and apply them to the realities that our legislators are facing in states today? And Chris, maybe we'll start with you and go around.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, I just want to say that I really affiliated with all three of those comments from the panelists, for all three panelists. And I think of, for Lara, I often will call it rising to the moment, but I thought it was actually more eloquently put by Laura in terms of, how she moved from empathy to what's required at this minute. And I thought that was really well done. And for Chon, he really gave us a resonating set of remarks, the power of service-oriented leadership, which cannot be overstated. And towards that end, how important it is to lead by example and go out front. And for Robbie, what a great way. I'm going to segue into answering your question with Robbie. I love the way he said, what is your superpower, your leadership superpower? Because, Maya's on the call here and she knows I teach this course on leadership and political change. And we begin the course talking about, how does a leader really discover, where are their strengths, their vulnerabilities, and their inner voice? And so there's this whole idea of learning about relationships, James McGregor Byrne on transformational leadership, which leads to, and if you believe that leadership really is a relationship, it's the leader and the led, and you work it together, then emotional intelligence becomes critically important. And I often mention to the class that, to much shock, that 40% of the Army's generals are actually introverts. And when I say that, like there's no way, there's that 40% of the Army generals, they are. And this gets to Robbie's point, is what is your superpower? Because that's the whole point, is that you can be an introvert and be a remarkable leader if you can figure out what is it that really you uniquely have. And so, and then dovetail, my last point on this is what Robbie talked about, purpose, 5 principles and 5 priorities. After, in our course where we talk about developing that sense of where you are and that idea of emotional intelligence and really looking to improve your own leadership skills, we then talk about you got to be strategic. And this is sort of my answer to the legislators too, is that I always talked in terms of vision, and then you talk about how do you move from a vision to a plan, and then how do you mobilize and communicate so that you can actually get to the end. And we use case studies. Dr. King, actually, and it's awesome you're having MLK3 as the speaker, because Maya knows we use Dr. King's case study. I mean, he talked about moving the earth. I mean, how hard was it to get to the top of that mountain, to get the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965? He did it. And he was being attacked from every imaginable corner. And, this being strategic really is finding that superpower you have, because the vision really needs to be shared. I use the example when I even recently here at Siena College has anybody ever had a moment when you've had double vision? How helpful is that? It's not, you banged your head or whatever, you have double vision. Imagine having like 500 vision, and that you're at your best when you see, with that vision, that mono vision. And that's the whole idea, is you want to eventually get the organization together, which means it may take a little bit of time. You got to have a little bit of patience, but when you get that shared vision and people are behind it, they're foursquare behind it, then you need to move that to a plan of action. But then what's key in a democracy for our legislators is mobilizing. And that's what Dr. King was so good at. He said, look, at this moment, we need drama. We need drama because we got to change America's heart. And so that was where he really found that inspiration from Gandhi. And he brought us that method of civil disobedience that led to change. And so I just want to say, I really, listening to the other panelists, I actually got great notes, because I feel like I'm going to be a stronger teacher now. I'm also a professor of leadership, and it was really tremendous the way they communicated. Thank you.
And I did it to myself. Lara, I'll call on you next. I saw you nodding a bunch.
Okay, I think I've unmuted now. So yeah, I mean, I would agree. This is such a fantastic panel, and I think this is part of what leadership is about, which is learning. I really think that one of the sort of tendencies of people who start to rise in organizations is actually to become more and more isolated. And I think as an actual strategy, you need to, in fact, engage more. You need to keep challenging yourself and putting yourself out there, listening to more people and learning from others, because there's always so much to learn. I agree 100% on the strategy and on the priorities. I mean, I'm somebody who walks around talking about, think about your organization's core competency and double down on that. And really, I'm not somebody who believes in kind of trying to do everything for everyone. You really want to focus on what you do best and then bring in other people who do those things well, because they will actually help you succeed. So I am somebody who believes kind of deep in my heart, leadership comes in all packages, and that really can learn how to be leaders, but we have to just stay open, stay flexible, and stay a little bit scared, because that's what keeps us learning.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, I'm getting the time check from my team, but I do want to have Robbie and Joan maybe chime in on a question that we got from one of our legislators, which is, what do you hope the legacy of the millennial generation can be, and what do you hope we can achieve between this generation and maybe Gen Z or the ones behind us? What do you hope the legacy will be?
Joan, you're closer to that generation than I am, so you go first.
Okay, so you can hear me well?
Yeah.
Yeah, great.
Well, I think the legacy of this generation, the millennials, will be, I talk to Steve about this all the time, will be what's missing today, that divide, how you can create that bridge, how you can unite the forces. So the divide that's in Washington, that's not only in Washington, D.C., but it's all over the world. The divide, the political divide in the country, in the United States, that's in Europe, it's in Africa, in class, in race, in economies, how we can close the gap so we can get back to the core of why we all are here. Because if you look at it, in the end, we all want the same things, right? We want the same things for our families, we want the same thing for our communities, we want the same thing for ourselves, for our children, for our countries. But if you take an example of the United States today, of the divide politically, your generation have a huge role to play, because today the millennials, they are more, I think, driven by not only party lines, but ideas. Your ideologies are stronger than I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican, right? And I think you should use that to build, to close the gap so that we can come back to the essential. How can we make lives better for our young people who are struggling to find jobs? How can we make sure education is more affordable? How can we make sure that our economy is thriving, and then everybody has a chance in the United States, and etc. This is only going to happen if the conversation of the essential is at the table. And I think MAP is playing that role, because I think what you're doing is phenomenal, because you can see in your organization young Republican representatives and young Democrat representatives, independents, even people who don't believe in parties, independents, and etc. They are all into the same conversation. And I think what you're asking, you already have the conversation. That's the DNA of MAP already. You just have to push that to make sure that it reaches the entire country, that we know beside the party lines and the divide, there is hope somewhere that is emerging slowly to bring us to the core of why we all are here and why we're doing and serving. Everything that we're doing in the end is for the benefit of all of us and our children.
Absolutely.
I'm glad I let Cheon go first, because he said it very, very well. I'll only add one small thought. Millennial generation has to be unafraid of change. I think there is my generation, I'm pretty old. My generation was sort of a status quo generation. This generation has to be willing to experiment, has to be willing to take on technological change and all the other things that are happening so quickly and channel them and not be afraid of change, but in fact, embrace it and drive it. And I think that's a really hard problem. It's a hard leadership problem to the point of our call. But I think, as Joan says, we can do that together. If we can drive that change together, I think this generation can make a huge difference.
Well, I think we're up to the challenge. So thank you all for joining us today. This was a fantastic conversation. There were a bunch of questions I wasn't able to get to, so we may need to do some follow-up to make sure that we keep the conversation going. But thank you so much for being here today. Next up for our legislators, and if you guys stick around for a minute, we'll have something for you right afterwards. But for our legislators, we'll be moving you into policy breakouts right now, facilitated by your fellow legislators on the call who've been leaders and pioneers on these issues that you identified when you first signed up and when you RSVP'd for this conference. So we'll have about 35-40 minutes in these groups, and then we'll briefly reconvene at the end to share our reflections, and then it's time for lunch. So we'll let you go and have a little break to eat and take care of any other work. So through the magic of Zoom, I believe Carly is about to work her magic and move you into your breakouts. So thanks, everyone.